as what I'm going to read momentarily is true to the original esoteric intentions of the original ancient Freemasonic tradition. So this is written by the Freemason C.W. Leadbeater. And that is, of course, a pseudonym because he's, the beater of the lead, the metals, the base metals, attempting to turn them into gold. It's an alchemical pseudonym. This is from his essay called Vegetarianism and Occultism. Vegetarianism and Occultism, which was published in 1913 by the Theosophical Publishing House. I'm going to read an excerpt from the earlier part of the essay, and I'm going to skip over the first entire section of the essay, which is all about the 5 sense aspect of vegetarianism, the bodily aspects of it, okay, which I covered last week. And you can read this. It's going to be posted with the podcast as well. I'm going to pick this up in the section where he talks about the occult reasons for being a vegetarian. But first, he defines what occultism is, and it's one of the best definitions of occultism that I've read. He says, Leadbeater says, quote, "How shall we define occultism? The word is derived from the Latin occultus, meaning hidden, so that it is the study of the hidden laws of nature. Occultism is the study of the hidden laws of nature. Since the great laws of nature are in fact working in the invisible world far more than in the visible, occultism involves the acceptance of a much wider view of nature than that which is ordinarily taken. The occultist, then, is a man who studies all the laws of nature that he can reach or of which he can hear. And as a result of his study, he identifies himself with these laws and devotes his life to the service of evolution." And he doesn't mean macrobiological Darwinian evolutionary theory. He's talking about evolution in consciousness, evolution toward the higher life, toward the higher self. Now, going farther in the document to the section called Occult Reasons for Vegetarianism, he says, quote, "Under this heading, also we shall have 2 sets of reasons, those which refer to ourselves and our own development, and those which refer to the great scheme of evolution and our duty toward it, so that once more we may classify them as selfish and unselfish, although at a much higher level than before. I have, I hope, clearly shown in the earlier part of this lecture that there is simply no room for discussion in regard to the question of vegetarianism. The whole of the evidence and of the considerations are entirely on one side, and there is absolutely nothing to be said in opposition to them. This is even more strikingly the case when we come to consider the occult part of our argument. There are some students hovering round the fringes of occultism who are not yet prepared to follow its dictates to the utmost. And when he says dictates, he's not talking about any particular system of occult teachings. He means the dictates of the laws of nature, which are dictates, meaning they're spoken into inherent reality by the Creator himself, and they're not suggestions. They're laws that are dictated by the Word, the energetic underlying intelligence of all creation. That's why they're natural laws. They're inherent, non-man-made, immutable, binding conditions, which we defined when we talked about natural law. So there are some students hovering around the fringes of occultism who are not yet prepared to follow its dictates to the utmost, and therefore do not accept its teaching when it interferes with their personal habits and desires. I'll say that again. People hovering on the fringes of these great teachings, these laws of nature, who are not yet prepared to follow the dictates of the laws of nature, therefore do not accept its teaching when it interferes with their personal habits and desires. Continuing, quote, some such have tried to maintain that the question of food can make little difference from the occult standpoint. But the unanimous verdict of all the great schools of occultism, both ancient and modern, has been definite on this point, and has asserted that for all true progress, purity is necessary, even on the physical plane, and in matters of diet, as well as in far higher matters. In many books and lectures, I have already explained the existence of the different planes of nature and of the vast unseen world all about us. I have also had occasion to refer often to the fact that man has within himself matter belonging to all these higher planes, so that he is furnished with a vehicle corresponding to each of them, through which he can receive impressions, and by means of which he can act. Can these higher bodies of man be in any way affected by the food which enters into the physical body, with which they are so closely connected? Assuredly they can. And for this reason, the physical matter in man is in close touch with the astral and mental matter, so much so that each is to a great extent a counterpart of the other. So he's saying there's really no separation. They're all affected. Each part of the self, each part of the dense, vital, astral bodies, they're all connected. They're all feeding off of each other's energy. What you do to one, you do to all. This is part of the non-separation, the unity aspect of consciousness. We have to stop looking at the physical and spiritual in separate terms, in terms of separateness. They are one. Continuing. There are many types and degrees of density among astral matter. For example, so that it is possible for one man to have an astral body built of coarse and gross particles, while another may have one which is much more delicate and refined. As the astral body is the vehicle of the emotions, passions, and sensations, it follows that the man whose astral body is of the grosser type will be chiefly amenable to the grosser varieties of passion and emotion, whereas the man who has a finer astral body will find its particles more readily its particles more readily vibrate in response to higher and more refined emotions and aspirations. The man, therefore, who builds gross and undesirable matter into his physical body is thereby drawing into his astral body matter of a coarse and unpleasant type as its counterpart. And then I'm interjecting, what do you think will be the result of the behavior of that individual? In most cases. Continuing, quote, we all know that on the physical plane, the effect of overindulgence in dead flesh is to produce a coarse, gross appearance in man. That does not mean that it is only the physical body which is in an unlovely condition. It means also that those parts of the man which are invisible to our ordinary sight, in other words, occulted, the astral and the mental bodies are not in good condition either. Thus, a man who is building himself a gross and impure physical body is building for himself at the same time coarse and unclean astral and mental bodies as well. That is visible at once to the eye of the developed clairvoyant. The man who learns to see these higher vehicles sees at once the effects on the higher bodies produced by impurity in the lower. He sees at once the difference between the man who feeds his physical vehicle with pure food and the man who puts into it this loathsome, decaying flesh. Let us see how this difference will affect the man's evolution. Impure vehicles is the next section. Quote, if it is clear that a man's duty with regard to himself is to develop all his different vehicles as far as possible, in order to make him finished instruments for the use of the soul, there is still there is a still higher stage in which that soul itself is being trained to be a fit instrument in the hands of the deity, a perfect channel for divine grace. But the first step towards this high aim is that the soul itself shall learn thoroughly to control the lower bodies, so that there shall be in them no thought or feeling except those which the soul allows. All these vehicles, therefore, should be in the highest possible condition of efficiency. All should be pure and clean and free from taint. And it is obvious that this can never be so long as the man absorbs into the physical encasement such undesirable constituents. So he's saying garbage in, garbage out. It's very simple. You put that which is of a lower vibratory energy in, you're going to have a lower vibratory energy be built as a result. These are the building materials, not only for the physical vehicle, but for the spiritual vehicles as well. Continuing, quote, even the physical body and its sense perceptions can never be at their best unless the food is pure. Anyone who adopts vegetarian diet will speedily begin to notice that his sense of taste or smell is far keener than it was when he fed upon flesh, and that he is now able to discern a delicate difference of flavors in foods which before he had thought of as tasteless, such as rice or wheat. The same thing is true to a still greater extent with regard to the higher bodies. Their senses cannot be clear if impure or coarse matter is drawn into them. Anything of this nature clogs and dulls them so that it becomes more difficult for the soul to use them. This is a fact which has always been recognized by the student of occultism. You will find that all those who in ancient days entered upon the mysteries were men of utmost purity and of course invariably vegetarian. Carnivorous diet is fatal to anything like real development, and those who adopt it are throwing serious and unnecessary difficulties in their own way. Leadbeater here is making the contention. He's actually claiming that those who studied and partook of the ancient mysteries were in fact almost invariably vegetarian. Continuing, quote, I am well aware that there are other and still higher considerations which are of greater weight than anything upon the physical plane, and that the purity of the heart and soul is more important than that of the body. Yet there is surely no reason why we should not have both. Indeed, the one suggests the other, and the higher should include the lower. There are quite enough difficulties in the way of self-control and self-development. It is surely worse than foolish to go out of our way and add another and very considerable one to the list. Although it is true that a pure heart will do more for us than a pure body, yet the latter can certainly do a great deal. And we are, none of us, so far advanced along the road towards spirituality that we can afford to neglect the great advantage that it gives us. Anything that makes our path harder than it need be is emphatically something to be avoided. In all cases, this flesh food undoubtedly makes the physical body a worse instrument and puts difficulties in the way of the soul by intensifying all the undesirable elements and passions belonging to these lower planes. Nor is this serious effect during physical life the only one which we have to think. If through inducing loathsome impurities into the physical body, the man builds himself a coarse and unclean astral body, we have to remember that it is in this degraded vehicle that he will have to spend the first part of his life after death. Because of the gross matter which he has built into it, all sorts of undesirable entities will be drawn into association with him and will make his vehicles their home and find a ready response within him to their lower passions. It is not only that his animal passions are more easily stirred here on earth, but in addition to this, he will suffer acutely from the working out of these desires after death. Here again, looked at even from the selfish point of view, we see that occult considerations confirm the straightforward common sense of the arguments on the physical plane. The higher sight, when brought to bear upon this problem, shows us still more vividly how undesirable the devouring of flesh, since it intensifies within us that from which we most need to be free. And therefore, from the point of view of progress, that habit is a thing that can be cast out once and forever. Man's duty toward nature. Then there is the far more important unselfish side of the question, that of man's duty toward nature. Every religion has taught that man should put himself always on the side of the will of God in the world, on the side of good against evil, of evolution as against retrogression. The man who ranges himself on the side of evolution realizes the wickedness of destroying life, for he knows that just as he is here in this physical body, in order that he may learn the lessons of this plane, so is the animal occupying his body for the same reason, that through it he may gain experience at his lower stage. He knows that the life behind the animal is the divine life, and that all life in the world is divine. The animals, therefore, are truly our brothers, even though they may be younger brothers. And we can have no sort of right to take their lives for the gratification of our perverted tastes, no right to cause them untold agony and suffering merely to satisfy our degraded and detestable lusts. We have brought things to such pass with our miscalled sport and our wholesale slaughterings, that all wild creatures fly from the sight of us. Does that seem like the universal brotherhood of God's creatures? Is that your idea of the golden age of worldwide kindliness that is to come? A condition when every living thing flees from the face of man because of his murderous instincts? There is an influence flowing back upon us from all this, an effect which you can hardly realize unless you are able to see how it looks when regarded with the sight of the higher plane. Every one of these creatures which you so ruthlessly murder in this way has its own thoughts and feelings in regard to all of this. It has horror, pain, and indignation, and an intense but unexpressed feeling of the hideous injustice of it all. The whole atmosphere about us is full of it. Twice lately I have heard from psychic people that they felt the awful aura or surroundings of Chicago, even many miles away from it. Miss Besant herself told me of the same things years ago in England, that long before she came in sight of Chicago, she felt the horror of it and the deadly pall of depression descending upon her, and asked, where are we? And what is the reason that there should be this terrible feeling in the air? To sense the effect as clearly as this is beyond the reach of the person who is not developed. But though all the inhabitants may not be directly conscious of it and recognize it as Mrs. Besant did, they may be sure that they are suffering from it unconsciously, and that terrible vibration of horror and fear and injustice is acting upon every one of them, though they know it not. The feelings of nervousness and profound depression which are so common there are largely due to that awful influence which spreads over the city like a plague cloud. I do not know how many thousands of creatures are killed every day, but the number is very large. Remember that every one of these creatures is a definite entity, not a permanent reincarnating entity like yours or mine, but still an entity which has a life upon the astral plane and persists there for a considerable time. Remember that every one of these remains to pour out his feeling of indignation and horror at all the injustice and torment which has been inflicted upon him. Remember for yourself that the terrible atmosphere which exists about those slaughterhouses. Remember that a clairvoyant can see the vast host of animal souls, that he knows how strong are their feelings of horror and resentment, and how those recoil at all the points upon the human race, at all points upon the human race. They react most of all upon those who are at least able to resist them, upon the children who are more delicate and sensitive than the hardened adult. That city is a terrible place in which to bring up children, a place where the whole atmosphere, both physical and psychic, is charged with fumes of blood and with all that means. So Leadbeater is saying here The morphogenic field is poisoned. The field of consciousness and energy that we all live in is poisoned as a result of this practice of carnism. And I made reference to that last week and will again in image number 12 on the slideshow. Look at the images and ask yourself the question, what is this practice doing energetically to the field of consciousness in which we are all living? I'm going to pause the reading here to go to a slide number 16 and just have people take a look at what's being said so far in this occult dynamic, the higher hidden dynamic, which is really what we need to understand what we're doing, not only to these beings, but to everyone, to ourselves, to the entire species, to other species most of all, okay? But we need to understand the self-inflicted effects through the laws of correspondence, the higher laws of nature, the laws that ultimately govern the consequences of our behavior. I showed this slide last week, but with no explanation. It was two small fish being eaten or pursued to be eaten by a larger fish, and then that fish ultimately being pursued to be consumed by an even larger fish. People will look at this thing, at this scenario, and they will say, well, that's the natural order. Everything eats everything else. This form of life eats that life, and then that life eats the life below it. And a life above it eats it. And this is a completely erroneous worldview when it comes to what the natural order actually is. This has nothing to do with the, quote, natural order. So I put on this slide, this scene does not depict the, quote, natural order. The natural order is that everything does not eat everything else. That is not what the natural order is. What this scene depicts is chaos, not order. Chaos is depicted in the scene where everything eats everything else and then is eaten by things above it that have its same level of consciousness, of low consciousness. This is not what the creation has intended for its creations. The Creator has not intended this for all of its creations to suffer in an eternal prison of eating and being eaten. This is a choice that is created by a belief system. That's what this picture is depicting. It depicts the chaos that we have chosen and created for ourselves through our false belief systems, or in other words, religions, of which carnism is one of the biggest on earth, along with the other false organized religions, along with the religion of authority, and ultimately the religion of money, which drives everything. All of our other negative belief systems largely driven by that belief, by that religion. That's the religion of the New World Order, as I called it, is the god of money. The middle fish in this depiction is humanity. That is the middle fish, the one that's eating the smaller fish below it, but being eaten by the big fish above it. That's us, folks. Whether you realize it, recognize it, want it to be true or not, that's us. Not because that's the natural order. That's where we've put ourselves. That's the condition we have created for ourselves by ignoring the laws of creation. And in that ignorance, we're creating this condition. This is not the universal natural order, the way it must be, the way it always has been and forever shall be. That's an erroneous worldview that is not based in truth at all. The fact of the matter is, this is what the human condition has become because of our attachments to religion, to false religious beliefs, to false belief systems in general. So this is what humanity has become like, and this is what humanity will be like for as long as we continue to engage in such fundamentally flawed ideologies like carnism and many others. That attachment is what is going to keep us in that position, and that is what the law of correspondence dictates, that as we do, so shall be done unto us. So if you want to be free, you have to allow other beings to be free. As long as you enslave and consume other beings, you will be enslaved and consumed. That is the law of creation. You just don't want to acknowledge it. You just don't want to admit that's how it is. You don't want to admit that that's the reason why you're in the prison that you're in. The My Freedom movement doesn't want to acknowledge that. It wants to say, I can have things both ways. I can still be a dominator. I can still be involved in the process of murder and domination over other beings. And somehow, magically, I can still have my freedom bestowed upon me. And it doesn't work that way, ladies and gentlemen. It doesn't work that way. Understand the laws of correspondence and causality. We're creating this prison for ourselves by our attachments to false belief systems. We break those false belief systems, we can step out of that chain. Again, this never-ending chain is all about the chain of obedience and attachment to falsity, to lies. We step outside of that attachment, we would be that fish stepping outside of that chain, no longer being a part of it, saying no. Saying no. And that's what it's going to take, that level of will, that level of care, that level of intelligence. Bringing all three of those aspects into harmony, into unison with each other, and engaging them. Now, next week, I'll wrap up the reading, the end of the reading of Leadbeater, but it will also be posted to the website. I think it bears finishing the last two sections where I paused just to finish it. But I want to basically wrap up with a phenomenal quote. This is in image number 17 by Gandhi, image number 17 in the slideshow. Gandhi said that a nation's moral progress can be judged by the way it treats its animals. So I started reading from the essay Vegetarianism and Occultism by C.W. Leadbeater last week. And I didn't get quite to finish that. We were talking about the occult reasons for ceasing the practice of carnism. And I want to finish that reading because we got into the second section where he started transitioning away from, some of the occult reasons we shouldn't do this for our own benefit. But there are also occult reasons, meaning hidden reasons, reasons based upon hidden knowledge, the knowledge of hidden laws of nature, which is what this show is all about. The laws of behavioral consequence, as I call them, or simply natural law, cosmic spiritual law, universal spiritual law is what we're talking about. Again, it needs to be clarified because when you use the term natural, that has a totally hijacked connotation in most people's minds because they've been hammered from their birth with this concept of Darwinism relating to the natural order when it has no such bearing. It has no such connection. So I want to continue reading this document to the end of it. This is Vegetarianism and Occultism by C.W. Leadbeater. We're near the end of the document. I want to pick up from the section called Man's Duty Toward Nature. Then I'm going to read the sections Ghastly Unseen Results and The Better Time to Come. So, quote, "Then there is the far more important unselfish side of the question, that of man's duty toward nature. Every religion has taught that man should put himself always on the side of the will of God in this world, on the side of good against evil, of evolution against retrogression. The man who changes himself on the side of evolution realizes the wickedness of destroying life. For he knows that, just as he is here in this physical body, in order that he may learn the lessons of this plane, so is the animal occupying his body for the same reason, that through it he may gain experience at his lower stage. He knows that the life behind the animal is the divine life, that all life in this world is divine, that animals therefore are truly our brothers, even though they may be younger brothers, and we can have no sort of right to take their lives for the gratification of our perverted tastes, no right to cause them untold agony and suffering merely to satisfy our degraded and detestable lusts. Very strong words there by Leadbeater, and I concur. It is our greed, our selfish interest, our attachment that makes us continue this practice. There is no other need for it. It is not a necessity, as we covered 2 weeks ago. We absolutely destroyed the normal, natural, necessary argument right here on this show and gave tons of supportive evidence to that fact. Continuing to quote Leadbeater, quote, "We have brought things to such a pass with our miscalled, quote, sport and our wholesale slaughterings that all wild creatures fly from the sight of us. Does that seem like the universal brotherhood of God's creatures? Is that your idea of the golden age of worldwide kindliness that is to come? A condition when every living thing flies from the face of man because of his murderous instincts? There is an influence flowing back upon us from all this, an effect which you can hardly realize unless you are able to see how it looks when regarded with the sight of the higher plane, the occult plane, in other words, the unseen, the difficult to see." Continuing, "Every one of these creatures which you so ruthlessly murder in this way has its own thoughts and feelings with regard to all this. It has horror, pain, and indignation, and an intense but unexpressed feeling of the hideous injustice of it all. The whole atmosphere about us is full of it. Twice lately I have heard from psychic people that they felt the awful aura of the surroundings of Chicago, even when many miles away from it. Mrs. Besant herself told me the same thing years ago in England, that long before she came in the sight of Chicago, she felt the horror of it and the deadly pall of depression descending upon her, and asked, 'Where are we? And what is the reason that there should be this terrible feeling in the air?' To sense this effect as clearly as this is beyond the reach of the person who is not developed. But though all the inhabitants may not be directly conscious of it and recognize it as Mrs. Besant did, they may be sure that they are suffering from it unconsciously, and that the terrible vibration of horror and fear and injustice is acting upon every one of them, even though they do not know it. In other words, our practices toward animals are affecting the field of consciousness, the interconnected field of energy in which we all are living. We're not separate from that vibratory, energetic field. And whether we're conscious of it or unconscious of it, it is having an effect upon our wellness, upon our well-being, and ultimately upon the conditions that we are living with, that we are living in, that are affecting us every day on a day-to-day basis. We're part of that dynamic. We are driving that dynamic through our behavior. The next section is called Ghastly Unseen Results. Quote, "The feeling of nervousness and profound depression which are so common there are largely due to that awful influence which spreads over the city like a plague cloud. I do not know how many thousands of creatures are killed every day, but the number is very large. Remember that every one of these creatures is a definite entity, not a permanent reincarnating individuality like yours or mine, but still an entity which has its life upon the astral plane and persists there for a considerable time. Remember that every one of these remains to pour out his feelings of indignation and horror at the injustice and torment which has been inflicted upon him. Realize for yourself the terrible atmosphere which exists about those slaughterhouses. Remember that a clairvoyant can see the vast hosts of animal souls, that he knows how strong are their feelings of horror and resentment, and how these recoil at all points upon the human race. They react most of all upon those who are least able to resist them, upon the children who are more delicate and sensitive than the hardened adult. That city is a terrible place in which to bring up children, a place where the whole atmosphere, both physical and psychic, is charged with fumes of blood and with all that that means. And Leadbeater is talking about the city of Chicago back at the turn of the century, which was the biggest meat production facility in the entire country and probably still is. Continuing, quote, I read an article only the other day in which it was explained that the nauseating stench which rises from those Chicago slaughterhouses and settles like a fatal miasma over the city is by no means the most deadly influence that comes up from that Christian hell for animals, though it is the breath of certain death to many a mother's darling. The slaughterhouses make not only a pest hole for the bodies of children, but for their souls as well. Not only are the children employed in the most revolting and cruel work, but the whole trend of their thoughts is directed toward killing. Occasionally one is found too sensitive to endure the sights and sounds of that ceaseless, awful battle between man's cruel lust and the inalienable right of every creature to its own life. It's all about the principle of ownership, folks. Don't take what you don't own. It's not your life to take from that animal. It is their life. They own their life. That is their right, as Leadbeater says. The right, the inalienable right of every creature to its own life. I read how one boy, continuing to quote, I read how one boy, from whom a minister had secured a place in the slaughterhouse, returned home day after day, pale and sick and unable to eat or sleep. And again, I guess this is even before some, child labor laws, and the children were put to work in these slaughterhouses back then. It's horrific. Continuing, he was day after day, pale and sick, unable to eat or sleep, and finally came to that minister of the gospel of the compassionate Christ and told him that he was willing to starve if necessary, but that he could not wade in blood another day. The horrors of the slaughter had so affected him that he could no longer sleep. Yet this is what many a boy is doing and seeing from day to day until he becomes hardened to the taking of life. And then someday, instead of cutting the throat of a lamb or a pig, he kills a man. And straightway we turn our lust for slaughter upon him and think that we have done justice. I read that a young woman who does much philanthropic work in the neighborhood of these pest houses declares that what most impresses her about the children is that they seem to have no games except games of killing. That they have no conception of any relation to animals except the relation of the slaughterer to the victim. This is the education which so-called Christians are giving to the children of the slaughterhouse, a daily education in murder. And then they express surprise at the number and brutality of the murders in that district. Yet your Christian public goes on serenely saying its prayers and singing its psalms and listening to its sermons, as if no such outrages were being perpetrated against God's children in that sinkhole of pestilence and crime. Surely the habit of eating dead flesh has produced a moral apathy among us. A moral apathy among us. Are you doing well, do you think, in rearing your future citizens among surroundings of such utter brutality as this? Even on the physical plane, this is a terribly serious matter. And from the occult point of view, it is unfortunately far more serious still. For the occultist sees the psychic results of all this, sees how these forces are acting upon the people, and how they intensify brutality and unscrupulousness. He sees what a center of vice and crime you have created, and how from it the infection is gradually spreading until it affects the whole country and even the whole of what is called civilized humanity. And I'll jump in there and say exactly. This is affecting the entire morphic field of consciousness that we are a part of. You engage in these practices, they do not stay where they are at. And just because you try to hide them and erect huge walls and fences, that doesn't mean that that energy isn't going beyond that area just because people aren't seeing it. If you want to really see what these practices are, and I guarantee you what you're even seeing there is not even the worst of it by any stretch of the imagination, watch the movie Earthlings. Watch it all the way through. Try to watch it through without looking away from the screen. And I'll bet you can't even do it. Most people don't have the stomach to do it. I congratulate someone who has the stomach to even sit through the entire thing. You have a strong constitution, and it should affect you negatively. That's what it's designed to do, and it's doing a good job of it, that documentary. It should make you feel sick, because that's the energy we're all taking in as a result of these practices. And you think that that's going to build a good body and brain? Please. Continuing with the document, quote, "The world is being affected by it in many ways, which most people do not in the least realize. There are constant feelings of causeless terror in the air. Many of your children are unnecessarily and inexplicably afraid. They feel terror of they know not what, terror of the dark, or when they are alone for a few moments. Strong forces are playing about us for which you cannot account. And you do not realize that this all comes from the fact that the whole atmosphere is charged with the hostility of these murdered creatures. The stages of evolution are closely interrelated, and you cannot do wholesale murder in this way upon your younger brothers without feeling the effect terribly among your own innocent children. Surely a better time shall come, when we shall be free from this horrible blot upon our civilization, this awful reproach upon our compassion and our sympathy. And when that comes, we shall find presently that there will be a vast improvement in these matters, and by degrees we shall all rise to a higher level and be freed from all these instinctive terrors and hatreds. The better time to come. We might all be freed from it very soon if men and women would only think. For the average man is not after all a brute, but means to be kind if he only knew how. He does not think. Let me repeat that again. He does not think. He goes on from day to day and does not realize that he is taking part all the time in an awful crime. But facts are facts, and there is no escape from them. Everyone who is partaking of this abomination is helping to make this appalling thing a possibility, and undoubtedly shares the responsibility for it. You know that this is so. You know that this is so. And you can see what a terrible thing it is, but you will say, what can we do to improve matters? We who are only tiny units in this mighty seething mass of humanity. It is only by units rising above the rest and becoming more civilized that we shall finally arrive at a higher civilization of the race as a whole. Let me read that sentence again, folks, because that's probably the most important sentence in this essay. It is only by units rising above the rest and becoming more civilized that we shall finally arrive at a higher civilization of the race as a whole. The quantum effect that I've been talking about, that many people have been talking about. It doesn't matter if you don't perceive that a lot of other people are doing it. It eventually, as individual units change themselves, a quantum effect will be built up as that amount rises, and it will eventually spill over to the whole. It is about numbers, but we need to get to that critical mass number when this becomes common sense knowledge. Our consciousness being elevated by desisting in such murderous practices, just, lifting our own consciousness up will be an influence in the whole field of consciousness for the totality of the all. Continuing, the quote, there is a golden age to come, not only for man, but for the lower kingdoms. A time when humanity will realize its duty to its younger brothers, not to destroy them, but to help them and train them, so that we may receive from them not terror and hatred, but love and devotion, and friendship, and reasonable cooperation. A time will come when all the forces of nature shall be intelligently working together towards the final end, not with constant suspicion and hostility, but with universal recognition of that brotherhood which is ours, because we are all children of the same Almighty Father. Let us at least make the experiment. Let us free ourselves from complicity in these awful crimes. Let us set ourselves to try. That's like that. I called that on the show, breaking in just for a moment. I called that phrase on the show on Rosicrucianism that I did with Bob from Cincinnati on Occult Empire. That's the ultimate Rosicrucian commandment. Try. We must try to improve ourselves. Engage the will to make ourselves better than we were the day before. If we're doing that, no one can fault us. Let us, continuing, quote, let us set ourselves to try, each in our own small circle, to bring nearer that bright time of peace and love, which is the dream and the earnest desire of every true-hearted and thinking man. At least we ought surely to be willing to do a small thing as this, so small a thing as this, to help the world onward toward that glorious future. We ought to make ourselves pure, our thoughts and our actions, as well as our food, so that by example, as well as by precept, we may be doing all that in us lies to spread the gospel of love and compassion, to put an end to the reign of brutality and terror, and to bring nearer the dawn of the great kingdom of righteousness and love, when the will of our Father shall be done upon the earth as it is in heaven. And I mean, that is just so profoundly powerful that I think it just speaks for itself and nothing else really needs to be.